Hello, I'm Doug Montgomery. I'd like to welcome you to our 9th Fireside Chat. We're recording this program as we always do, and we've posted the previous 8 Fireside Chat recordings on Coursera. You can find them in the resources tab of your course, and not long after we conclude today's Fireside Chat, this recording will be posted there as well. For those of you that are new to the Fireside Chat, remember, we want you to keep your microphones muted and your videos turned off, so it won't interfere with our program. If you want to send in a question to our guest, Christine Anderson Cook, or to me, please do that using the chat function in Zoom. And there's no need to wait until the Q&A part of our program starts. Please do this anytime you want during the session. And once our guest is finished with her presentation, we'll start answering those questions. And if we don't get them answered during the time that we have set aside for this during the program, we'll take care of that offline, and the answers will be posted in Coursera for those people that are enrolled in the course. So with that, I'd like to introduce our guest today. I'm really pleased to have Dr. Christine Anderson Cook as our guest. Christine is a research scientist in the Statistical Sciences Group at Los Alamos National Lab, and she's been involved in a wide range of projects there in the areas of nuclear non-proliferation, sequential design of experiments for carbon capture, cybersecurity, reliability engineering, and using advanced data techniques for detecting radioactive materials. So she's had a wide range of experiences and applications. Before joining the lab, she was a faculty member in the stats department at Virginia Tech, and her research interests include design of experiments, including response surface methods, reliability, multi-criterion optimization, and data-centric decision-making. And full disclosure here, Christine and I are co-authors of a book entitled Response Surface Methodology with a former colleague of ours, the late Ray Myers. And the 4th edition of that book was published, I believe, in 2016, and it is a very good follow-on to the textbook for this course. And in fact, a lot of the material that we cover in course 3 and course 4 of our MOOC are covered in much more detail in that book than they are in mine. Christine is a fellow of the American Statistical Association and the American Society for Quality. She's been on the editorial boards of a number of our important journals: Technometrics, JQT, Quality and Reliability Engineering International, Quality Engineering Journal of Statistics Education. She also writes a column for Quality Progress. She is a recipient of the ASQ Short Medal and the ASQ Statistics Division William G. Hunter Award. And I recently found out that she is going to be the 2021 recipient of the George Box Medal from INBUS. That's the European Network for Business and Industrial Statistics, an honor which she richly deserves. So with that, I'm going to let Christine Anderson Cook take over, and she has a nice presentation for us this morning, which I think you're really going to enjoy on sequential experiments.
Great, thank you, Doug. This is a great opportunity to share some work that I've been doing in the last little while, primarily focused around carbon capture and using sequential design of experiments, but I think it's very broadly applicable beyond that, and so hopefully that will be of interest today. So I think there's a real opportunity for breaking your experiments into smaller pieces where we can learn between the stages. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and then some tools that will be very helpful to make that process a lot easier. So, All right, so suppose that you're going on a multi-day trip and you have two choices. One, before you step out the door, someone wants you to commit to the street by street route that you're going to take from start to finish, or someone gives you the option to do the first part of your route, and then maybe every evening figure out where you are, how much energy you have, what the weather looks like, how the traffic was, and adapt the next step of your journey to figure out what you want to do for the next day, and then repeat that process. Well, I think for most of us, it would be a no-brainer that we would choose option 2. It's a lot more flexible, and we know that at the end of each day, we will have learned something that's going to help inform what we should be doing the next day. And so the same logic can apply to collecting data. Why would we commit the entire experimental budget right at the beginning of our experiment when we have the opportunity to learn as we go? And so I think that's sort of the main message of today, that I think for many practitioners, they feel, and what they've learned in a first course is that you should just plan everything right from the start. And I think there's opportunities to break it into smaller chunks. So let's talk a little bit about one-shot experiments versus sequential experiments. So historically, when Sir Ronald Fisher introduced the notion of design of experiments, it was in the context of agriculture. And so in that context, a one-shot experiment makes tremendous sense. So you might make the choices of, what fertilizer levels to use, how much water you're going to put on the different treatments. You then plant the crops, and you have to wait a whole growing season to see how it turns out. And so at the end of the growing season, you harvest the crops and you measure the results. And so if you wanted to break that into smaller pieces, it would mean several growing seasons would need to be involved. And so there's certainly moments where that one-shot experiment makes tremendous sense. But in a lot of other contexts, particularly in industrial applications, we can run a set of experimental runs, measure the results, and do an analysis pretty quickly. And so in those contexts, there's an opportunity to sort of break things into little pieces. So collect a bit of data, figure out what happened, update our thinking, and then use that updated thinking to collect the next bit of data and repeat the cycle. And so that's sort of the theme of sequential design of experiments. So what I'll talk about in the next 25 minutes or so is a little bit about the basics of sequential design of experiments. So SDOE is the acronym that we use. When does it make sense to consider running them? And then one of the things that I think experimenters sometimes are a bit weak on is figuring out the specific objective that they have for the experiment. And so I'll talk about a couple of different objectives that we might have and how they might be combined into a sequence for our SDOE. And then the second part of the talk is to walk through two new space filling design approaches that a colleague of mine, Lulu, at the University of South Florida, and I have proposed that sort of enrich the set of tools that we can use as part of SDOE. So when does it make sense to consider running a sequential design experiment? So I've talked about the first one, and that's sort of the time factor. So if it's possible to collect and measure and analyze the data in a timely fashion, then the implementation of an SDOE works nicely. Another thing that's very beneficial is if the process is stable and consistent over time. So that makes combining the data from the different stages much easier to do. And I will put a little asterisk beside that one, that if you have a process that isn't stable and consistent, I think you're going to have problems figuring out what happened in your experiment and using it to generalize what's going to happen in the future. So that's something that's important for most experiments. If there's uncertainty in the input region of interest, so maybe we're still figuring out the boundaries, what sort of ranges are important for each of the inputs, we can avoid wasting resources by putting experimental runs in undesirable regions. This theme of several objectives, I'll talk about a little bit more shortly, but essentially the idea is it's often easier if we have several objectives to break them into individual sub-experiments and then move through a progression of first I'm going to focus on exploration, then I'm going to focus on refining my model, and so on. Another situation where SDOEs can be particularly effective is if you're starting to explore a brand new process. So we don't know much of what's going on. So each one of those stages in sequential design of experiments is an opportunity to build what you know and then react to what you've learned. And then lastly, sometimes we have limitations on the number of runs we can do in a day or a week. And so that might be a natural blocking mechanism to be able to organize how we run the experiment. All right, so here is a collection of data collection with multiple objectives. And as I say, sometimes experimenters are not very good at being precise about what they're trying to accomplish with an experiment. And so I'll outline 5 different objectives that we might have, and then how they might fit into a sequence naturally. So we might begin with a pilot study where this is usually a very small experiment where we're just trying to convince ourselves that we can collect the quality of data that we need, we can measure the attributes that are going to be of interest for our responses. And then once we feel confident that we're getting good quality data, then we want to explore the input space. So this is to just get a sense of what are some of the basic trends that we have, are there constraints on our region, and then figure out what the basic relationships look like. And we might do several mini experiments in that idea of exploring the input space. Now I understand the basic trends, and so I'd like to build a model that captures those relationships in a more formal way. And once I've got that model, I may want to collect a bit more data to further refine that model and make sure that I'm estimating the model parameters as well as I need to, or I'm able to predict throughout the input space of interest. Now I've got a model that I have confidence in, so let me use that model. And so I may want to optimize one or more of my responses. And so the goal here is to collect some data near the optimum that allows me to really understand the conditions that I've got going on there. The final step is often a small little experiment where I'm just confirming what I've learned. I've identified the best location, and I just want to make sure that I understand the natural variability there. And also I can translate that operating condition maybe into production or some bigger environment. So that sequence of steps in many experiments that I've been involved in, we've got at least a progression of those or a subset of those that we actually feel are important. And I know in the course that you're taking right now with Dr. Montgomery, you're focused on model-based approaches where you've got an underlying model that you're trying to construct a design to be able to estimate well. So this process is general enough to work well there, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about space filling designs because that may be a kind of design that maybe you haven't seen too often before. So let me walk through a little cartoon version of that progression just to get a feeling for what it might look like. So we've got 2 inputs here in a regular rectangular input space. Maybe input number 1 is the temperature of an oven, and input 2 is the time that I'm placing my product in the oven. And so I might start with a pilot experiment. So here are just 2 runs where I'm making sure that I can adjust the temperature on my oven, and I'm getting the quality of data that I need for my response. And so I've used 2 of my available 18 runs that I have available for the budget. Now I want to do some exploration throughout the input space. So here are 6 more runs that I've used for exploration. And you can see that what I've done is I haven't put any of those new blue experimental runs close to the pilot runs. So I'd like to explore away from where I already have some knowledge that I've gained from the pilot experiment. So after the exploration, maybe I figure out that putting my item in the oven at a hot temperature for a long time is not a particularly smart combination. And so I might refine my input region and say, I don't need more data in that corner because I'm not producing useful parts. And so now I would like to build a model. And so here I've used 5 more runs for model refinement. And again, I've placed those new points far away from where I already had data. And so that enables me to build a model that characterizes the relationship between temperature and time in the oven and whatever my responses are of interest. From that model, I can get a sense of where good operating conditions are. So inside that oval, maybe I believe that that is where things look most promising for a high quality product. And so I'll run a little experiment that optimizes my relationship in there, make sure I understand what's happening. So another 3 runs. And then finally, a confirmation experiment. Those are 2 runs right where I think the optimum should go. That allows me to understand the variability of production conditions at that location and confirm that I can actually get the responses that I need. So that's a sequence of 18 runs. And I've done it in 5 stages that match the objectives that I talked about on the previous slide. So let's compare that to what would have happened if I did a one-shot experiment. So on the right-hand side, you can see an 18-run space-filling design. And well, what happened? So if we look in this corner that I identified pretty quickly, the hot temperatures for a long time, I actually ended up with this one-shot experiment putting 4 runs out of 18 in that corner. So nearly a quarter of my runs ultimately were kind of wasted in that I don't think it's that interesting. And you can see inside the oval, which is close to the optimum, I also have many fewer observations there than with the sequential design of experiments approach. And so I don't have that richness of information close to where I'm actually going to be operating. So here, hopefully this has convinced you that the sequential approach could have some advantages in terms of being able to answer questions one after another and end up with a distribution of the data close to where I'd like it. Okay, so that's the basics of sequential design of experiments. The second part of this focuses on some tools that we need if we're going to cobble together these different stages of designed experiments to be able to fulfill the needs for each of the objectives that we're targeting. So 2 new kinds of space-filling designs, a non-uniform space-filling design and an input response space-filling design. I'll talk about sort of what goes into those and where they might be useful. So if you know a little bit about space-filling designs, almost certainly it's a uniform space-filling design. And as the name suggests, the goal is to put the design points uniformly throughout the specified region of interest. And I've shown 3 scenarios on the right-hand side. So the first one is sort of the most standard, where we've just defined a regular region. So here, think temperature and time again. And I just want to fill that space in a straightforward way. The second scenario is when I have some historical data or previously collected data shown by the blue dots. And then I want to space fill around those points that I have. And so this is going to be a very important category for us for the sequential design of experiments. And we might call this an augmented design. And then the last case is that we've got an irregular region, maybe like the oven example where we've decided we don't want to operate in that top right corner. So we have an irregular space and we want to do space filling there. And so all 3 of these scenarios are ones that I want to be able to address with any of my space filling designs. So the non-uniform space filling design takes the idea that everything is of equal interest and says, well, maybe not. Maybe the experimenter knows something and they want to take advantage of that. And so if you look at the design on the right, I've specified some weights associated with different regions. And so think of this as climbing up to the top of a hilltop. And so I'm most interested at things in the top of the hill and less interested at the further I get away from the top of that hill. And so if I look at the design that I've created with this non-uniform space filling category, you'll see that the concentration of points is higher in the at the top of the mountain than it is down the slopes. And so that is just sort of the goal of this, is that we're breaking the assumption that all regions of our input space are of equal interest. So the way that this works is that we're handing control to the experimenter. We're assuming that they know something about their process from previous stages of the experiment. And so they're able to provide information about what's of interest, what's more interesting, and what's less interesting. And so here they've provided these contours where, again, we're looking at the top of a mountain where we think that this is the most interesting spot. And as we move away from that to the edges, it becomes less interesting to us. So that's something that the experimenter is going to provide. And then we're going to give them a knob, so something that they can turn, whereas you move from left to right, we're changing the concentration of the points at the top, or the most desirable region. So we're handing the experimenter control of where is it important, and then how important is it relative to the other space. And so we're sort of allowing them to sort of tune what kind of design that they want to have and its characteristics. So how am I going to set up those weights? The weights are really the key to being successful with this. And so there's really 4 scenarios, I think, where we might think about this non-uniform space filling design being useful. So the first one is if we're trying to optimize a response and we have an estimate of the response, I might put bigger weights associated with more desirable regions of that predicted response. And so then that's going to cluster the points closer to where I think the desirable regions are. I can define the weights to focus on interesting features. So maybe my function changes a lot in some spaces and changes very slowly in others. Then it may make sense to assign big weights to quickly changing areas and less weight to the regions where things change slowly. In the model refinement stage, it can make sense that we have regions where prediction is good and not so good. And so if we think about using a prediction interval as our metric, wide prediction intervals say that I have large uncertainty. And so I may want to assign a large weight to those. So I put points, new points close to where I don't have good prediction, and collecting data there will improve our ability to narrow those prediction intervals most dramatically. And then lastly, with computer experiments, we may have a discrepancy that the model says, I think one behavior is happening, but when we observe the data, that doesn't match. And so we can assign bigger weights where we see that discrepancy to really help us figure out what's going on, why our model and the data aren't matching. So very flexible in terms of how the experimenter assigns the weights, and we can use it for different objectives. All right, the second kind of new space filling design is an input response space filling design. And everything that we've talked about so far has focused on making sure that the points are well spread out through the input space. Well, what if we actually care about getting a good spread throughout the response space? We want to, in fact, explore the entire range of possible values for our response. And so this input response category helps to tackle that. So here is a nice space filling design, a uniform space filling design with 10 runs in our 2-dimensional space. And you can see I've superimposed here the contours correspond to what I predict the response will look like. And so now when I look at where those 10 runs end up for what values I expect to get for the response, you can see it doesn't look great. I've got some regions where I've got a lot of runs sort of bunched up. So here between 46 and 47, you can see there's sort of a ring where there's a lot of design points close to those contours. So I'm getting a lot of runs there, and I'm getting almost no runs close to 44 or 48. So if I'm interested in understanding sort of the range of responses that I'm getting, this design isn't particularly effective. And so this balancing of input and response may be suitable if we just want to understand across the whole range of outputs, or if we've got a nested design where we run a first experiment on a sub portion of the system, and then we're using the outputs from that model as inputs for the next size of model. Then we want good spread throughout that, what now has become an input space for the bigger model. So why not just focus only on the response only piece? So here I've created a design for the same set of contours where now you can see these purple lines are very nicely spread out. I've got them equally spaced throughout the inputs, the response space. So that one's looking beautiful. But when I look at how that turned out in the input space, I've got a lot of big gaps where I'm not collecting any data. So I'm not too happy about that. And so the goal of these input response space filling designs is to find a suitable balance for the input space and also across the range of the response space. So to talk about these, we need to fill in a little gap. For those of you who may be familiar with some of my papers with Lou, you'll know that Pareto fronts are a very useful tool to be able to consider multiple objectives simultaneously. So think of criterion 1 here as a design criterion for how well we're space filling in the response space. Criterion 2 along the x-axis, how well are we filling the space in the input space, where bigger is better. So ideally, we'd like to have a design that actually is great at both. And so let me just take that away. You'll see there is no design point there. So each one of these circles corresponds to a design that I could run, and the utopia point is not possible. So what the Pareto front does is it finds the collection of designs that are as close to that best design, which doesn't exist, as possible. And we just choose from among them. So any design that's not on the Pareto front has something on the Pareto front that's objectively better than that. And so we just have to concentrate on values on the Pareto front. So a very useful general tool. Here we're using it for space filling in the input and response space. So we've looked at these two designs at the edges. So here the response only was great, as big as you can get in the y-axis direction, but pretty crummy in the input space. At the other extreme of our Pareto front, this is the input only design. It's great for filling up the space in the inputs, but terrible for the responses. And so what we're going to do is look at the Pareto front, which is a set of alternatives that are some good objectives that balance things. And remember, lurking here is a whole bunch of designs that I don't even have to look at because the Pareto front ones are just necessarily better than any of those alternatives. So here are a couple of pictures of designs that are on the Pareto front. So the first one, you can see it's not quite as good at space filling in the response space. So it's not as perfect as the other one for equal spacing, but already we've made some improvements where the holes in this input space are a little smaller. As we slide along closer to the input only design, you can see my space filling in the input space is a lot better, but I'm starting to get a little more patchy with my space filling in the response space, but I don't have any runs that are super close to each other. And so again, this is a tool where we've given the experimenter to control to see some alternatives and then pick the one that matches what makes sense for their particular experiment and what balance they need. All right, so how do we use these building blocks for a particular experiment? So I'll focus on the exploration, model building and refining, and optimization stages, and just tell you how we might put together a couple of sequences here. So case 1, exploration, we might start with a uniform space filling design, just to understand the basics of what's going on. And then we might augment it with a second uniform space filling design, where the kicker here is that if my assumptions about what the interesting input space were correct, then I might just augment into the same space. But a lot of times I got it a little bit wrong. Maybe I need to shift that space a little bit in one of the inputs. Maybe I need to chop off a corner, add a constraint of declaring something not that interesting. And so this second augmented uniform space filling design gives us the option to really sort of adjust to what we've learned in the first stage and make maximum use of those resources for the second stage. Okay, case 2, I want to optimize a response. So again, I don't know too much about what's happening with the relationship between inputs and the response. So I start off with a uniform space filling design. Then I build a model, and that model maybe is okay, but maybe it's not that good at predicting. So I can do an augmented non-uniform space filling design where I'm declaring the weights to be proportional to the width of my prediction intervals. So big weights will be associated with wide prediction intervals. And so I'll be targeting regions in my input space where I'm not predicting very well. And that's a very efficient way to improve the model. Now I've got an improved model, and I can augment that with another non-uniform space filling design. But this time I'm going to declare the weights to be based on how desirable my response is that I'm getting from the model. And so then I'm targeting regions in the input space that I think will lead to very good responses. All right, the third case, I want good prediction throughout. So again, I start off not knowing too much. So a uniform space filling design is a good starting point. And then I might augment it with an input response space filling design that allows me to use the model that I constructed to figure out how to get that spread throughout the range of the outputs or the response to be a little more balanced. And so that two-stage design can lead to a nice collection of good space filling in the input space, as well as good space filling in the response space. Okay, just to wrap things up, I think many experimenters don't think about breaking their experiment into small chunks. And so just having that on your radar as something to consider is going to be very important. And so the key characteristic is that we can collect data, measure the responses, and update our models in a timeliness that allows us to incorporate what we've learned so that the next stage, we're starting at a more informed position than we were when we started the first stage. Sequential designs of experiments can sort of get those aha moments earlier in the process. I think many times just when we see that first wave of data, it really allows us to update our thinking about what's going on. And so moving that early in the process is a good thing. We can avoid wasting runs by not putting them in undesirable regions. We can get a bigger concentration of points in regions of maximum interest where we have flexibility about how we define that maximum interest. It allows us to move through a sequence of objectives to focus on one, have a good design for that objective, and then move on to the next one based on improved knowledge. And then these new space filling designs, the non-uniform and the input response space filling designs, give us some additional building blocks that allow flexible choices at each stage. And so I think that collection together with the idea of a clear definition of what you're trying to accomplish with collecting data and then breaking it into chunks is a very powerful combination for an effective experiment. Here are just some references about different aspects of sequential design of experiments and those building blocks. And they can fill in some details that take things beyond where I was able to talk about them today. All right, thank you. And I'll stop sharing here.
Thank you, Christine. Very, very interesting presentation. I'd like to let folks taking the course know that we do talk about space filling designs in the course. And there is material on space filling designs in chapter 11 of the textbook, but these are kind of the traditional space filling designs. There are things like the uniform design and the Latin hypercube design that are used a lot in computer experiments. And so what you're showing here are two new and I think really exciting approaches to using for constructing space filling designs, and then using them in some pretty novel ways. We do talk about sequential experiments some in the course, but in very traditional kinds of ways. Probably the two most traditional ways are in follow-on experiments for fractional factorials. You know, you've run a resolution 3 or a resolution 4 fractional factorial design, and you're having difficulty interpreting the results because of the aliasing structures, and so you want to add runs to de-alias effects, and we talk about that in the course, and there's a couple of examples of that in the course and in the textbook. And then the traditional industrial sequential experiments, where you run a screening experiment, you figure out what the important factors are, and then you run another experiment with a central composite design, let's say, to do optimization. So we talk about that, but what you've done is quite a novel way to think about sequential experiments that's really not covered in the book and in the course per se. And that's why I wanted you to give this talk, because this is some really new thinking on this topic that I think is really important. And in fact, the next time I revise the book, I'm going to have to put some of this material in there, because it is extremely important. It is extremely important. And, you know, almost all industrial experiments are sequential experiments. I mean, I've you know, my own experience in doing this for a very long time. I mean, I'm older than dirt, okay, and I've been doing this forever, okay, and almost every industrial experiment that I have ever seen has been sequential, and a lot of times it's simply because you have more factors than you can conveniently run in your first set of experiments. I remember our winemaking experiments in Oregon. We started off with a list of like 16 or 17 factors that we wanted to study in our winemaking process, but the maximum number of runs that we could make in any one growing season was 16. So I made an arbitrary executive decision, and I said, we're going to run no more than 8 factors in any one experiment, because 8 factors and 16 runs, at least I can estimate reliably the main effects of those 8 factors. And you know, we went on from there to learn, you know, that a lot of those 16 or 17 factors weren't very important, but there were some that were really key. So again, thank you very much. This has really been a super, to me, a super informative session. And I guess we probably ought to start thinking about questions. And Christine, feel free to jump in on any of these questions and help me answer them. The first one is an interesting question. How can you interpret a 3-way interaction if it's statistically significant? Well, first of all, significant 3-factor interactions don't happen a lot. I don't know, maybe if I look back on my own experience, it's maybe 5% of the time when you run an experiment, you find a significant 3-factor interaction. Is that kind of your experience too, Christine?
Yeah, so 2-factor interactions I think are quite common.
Yes.
Right? You've got 2 that are doing things, but 3-factor ones I agree are quite rare. And yeah, certainly the interpretation of them starts to get a little tricky because there's a lot of moving parts.
Yeah, and the way I usually recommend doing it is to think of the 3-factor interaction as a 2-factor interaction that is different at different levels of the 3rd factor. And so, you know, one way that you might interpret that would be to construct, let's say you have all of your factors at 2 levels. So you might pick 2 of the factors and do a 2-factor interaction plot for level 1 of the third factor, and then do another 2-factor interaction plot for level 2 of the third factor, and see how different those interaction plots are. And you might have to play around with this a bit in order to get the right combination of things, as to which ones you're actually drawing the interaction plot with respect to. But that's a suggestion, and I've done that, and it's worked out fairly well for me. What do you think about that, Christine?
I think that sounds good. And as you say, the key is to, think of the low and high level factor, that first one that you're doing the 2 plots on, try all 3 of them and see which one sort of gives you the best look at the changing pattern that you've got there.
Exactly.
I think that helps with the interpretation.
Yeah,
for sure.
Because it may not be obvious, until you look at the different plots. But this is a good question, and it does come up. Okay. Let's say I'm building a statistical model, and I suspect that some of the features may be correlated with times. Let's say that each row in my data set has a timestamp. And would the F-test between each feature and the timestamp be a good way to determine if each such feature is correlated with time? And my thinking is along the lines of this Wikipedia article, which talks about analysis of covariance. And I've seen that article, and there is actually a discussion and several examples of analysis of covariance in the textbook. It's one of the topics in the last chapter of the book, and we do talk about it a little bit in course number 4 of our MOOC. Usually, what I've done is if I have a covariate, is I will plot. I'll just do a simple graph of the response versus the covariate. I'll just look at a scatter diagram, and you're looking for correlation between the response variable and the covariate, and that's usually a very good starting point. You might your suggestion here is sort of fitting a regression model and maybe looking at the significance of regression. You may not even need to go that far. You may be able to do it with a simple scatter diagram. If you have more than one covariate, say you've got timestamp and something else, some physical characteristic that you measured on the response, then you might have to do a regression model and rely on something like a statistical test. But usually if all you have is a single covariate, what time or something you've measured, you can a scatter diagram is going to give you the insight. Okay.
So, a couple of little ideas. Sorry to jump in there, Doug.
Yeah.
This is sort of a reminder of the importance of randomization.
Yeah.
That randomizing those runs, the order that you run them in, offers you some protection if you do in fact have a time trend. And then
Right.
I guess something that I would try is fit the effects that you planned and were manipulating, fit a model for that, and then add in that covariate and just see how the R-squared changes, to see if once you've got the things you intend to focus on in the model, does adding that time trend actually make a substantial improvement to the
Right.
model? And this is a case where you don't want it to make a big difference, because that says the time thing is actually wagging the dog. And so
Right.
you need to be a little careful of that one.
Right. Yeah. If time is your covariate, lots of times randomization could eliminate that. And I'm thinking more generally in terms of the covariate is something that you measure along with the response, which might not be time. The classic example that I often use is cattle feeding. You have 3 different cattle feeds, and you want to see which one produces the most weight gain in the animals. And so you have your cows and you divide them up randomly into 3 groups, and you feed each group one of the cattle feeds. Well, when you measure the amount of weight gain at the end, In most cases, the amount of weight that the animal gained is also a function of what their initial weight was. So you have a natural covariate, which is the initial weight of the animal. And these kinds of things happen all the time. I can remember an experiment that I was involved in some years ago where we were looking at a polymerization process, and the output response from that polymerization process was a function of a couple of chemical properties, physical properties of the input raw material, like viscosity. And that was completely uncontrollable. Okay, there was no way that you could control that. Every batch of material that you got had a unique viscosity, and so you had to treat that as a covariate. It's the only way to do it. The problem comes up a lot. Okay, when we calculate the standard deviation, sometimes we divide by n-1, and sometimes by n. Well, it sort of depends on the situation. If the data that you have represents the entire population, okay, then dividing by n is appropriate, because when you compute the deviations, y minus y bar, you're actually computing y minus mu, because that y bar is actually the true mean of the population. But when your data is a sample, then y bar is an estimate of the mean, and so you only have n-1 degrees of freedom basically between those differences. And so dividing by n-1 is appropriate when you have sample data, and dividing by n is appropriate when you have the entire population. Is that a logical way to explain that, you think, Christine?
Oh, perfect. I think just the degree of freedom for having estimated the mean in a sample, that to me is the key idea. Right.
And I can remember when pocket calculators did calculation for the very first generation of pocket calculators that did statistics calculations. Some calculators gave you a choice of dividing by n or dividing by n-1. So you punched in the data, and then I've seen students struggling. Now which one of these two keys do I push? Do I push the n-1 key, or do I push the n key? And I think it was Hewlett-Packard that finally straightened that out on one of their calculators by labeling one of the keys S and the other key sigma. And that solved the problem for a lot of people, because when you have the whole population, you're calculating the true population standard deviation. And when you have sample data, you're calculating the sample standard deviation, S. And so Hewlett-Packard finally made it easy for me to explain that to my students by labeling the keys in an interesting way. Okay, so another question. Oh, now this is a good one. Suppose you have a large amount of data, maybe millions of rows. Wow. And you know that there are outliers, but there are too many to manually identify. Is there an automated outlier ID identification method that you would recommend? Well, that's an interesting question, and there are things that you can do. This could be a place where something as simple as a control chart might be appropriate. I don't know. There are other methods, but something as simple as a control chart could possibly be useful, because that would certainly identify. I'm assuming these are individual observations, so something like a control chart would maybe be a place to start. Christine, other ideas that you might have here?
So I think there are a variety of metrics that sort of measure how far things
Mhm.
are away from the center of the distribution. And so it seems like for your millions of rows, if you could do some triage on that to get started and just, okay, here's a whole bunch that are close to the middle and then some that are further away from the middle. If you could just cut that down and be looking at the 1 or 2% that score big on some of these metrics away from the center, then you've got a manageable problem to sort of look at each one in a more individual way and figure out, in which dimension is it far away and some of those things. So
Mhm.
that would be my starting point is, throw some metrics at the whole collection of data and then get it down to a manageable number that you can investigate individually.
Yeah, the control chart is one way to kind of do that.
Yes.
But there are some other things that you could do too. You could look at something as simple as computing the percentiles of the data, and take a look at the percentiles that are remote. The 99th and or 99.5th percentile and the first percentile, and take a look at that. So there are a variety of screening techniques that you could use to do that. But that's kind of a big topic. There's a lot of things that you could do. Okay, suppose we design an experiment to diagnose the root, let's say cause of an issue. Let's say we have 5 hypotheses. Can we test these all in one hypothesis test, or is it necessary to split them up into 5 tests? Let's say we only care about knowing how to fix the issue, not knowing exactly which hypothesis is the cause. That's pretty general. I don't know.
So my thought on this is that you absolutely want to, if you're doing a root cause analysis, you want to know which of those 5. So even if it's not necessary to do them separately, I think it's highly desirable that, the way to improve your process is to tweak a knob or to change
Yeah,
something. And being as specific as possible about that change feels like it's just what you want. So I think the bundling of them together probably is going to muddy the waters, and figuring out which one is actually driving your process to have problems. That feels like exactly the answer that you want.
yeah, and unless there is some way to jointly vary these factors and separate the effects with maybe some sort of factorial type structure. But I generally agree with you that you really probably need to look at individual tests. Yeah. Okay, here's another one. Working on a marketing experiment that plays with offers to the customer. Some factors that I try to vary are interrelated and depend on some other factor. And can you advise on a way to solve this? To give a more concrete example, suppose that offer can be a single level offer or a multi-level one, and at their own level, we can vary the number. So, for example, you might have a factor in a credit card offer, like interest rate, and so you could have a low and a high level of the interest rate, and you could also maybe have a middle level of the interest rate. You should, I would think in a lot of cases that you should be able to treat this as a single multi-level factor. I mean, I'm thinking that I can see cases where that would be the case, but maybe there are some that don't fit into that way of thinking. Christine, you have any thoughts on this?
So the way I was interpreting the multi-level one was that sort of a nested set of choices inside of one, so that you've got a low, medium, high interest rate, but maybe if you choose the middle interest rate, then some other factor has multiple choices.
Mm.
So if that's the right interpretation, then I think what you said about just saying, well, actually, instead of 3 choices, I've got 5 choices, then
Right.
examine each one of those as well. How did people do, you know, whichever branch they followed, and do a comparison there. But I'm not quite sure I'm confident I've interpreted the question right.
Me too, but I hadn't thought about the idea of nesting factors, but that could be a way to deal with that, because depending on which level you choose for the say the upper level, the choices might be different below that, and so that would lead to a nested type structure in the experiment. And you know, I've never seen that in a marketing experiment, but it could happen. I've done some consulting work for credit card companies, and you know, multi-level factors were fairly common there. And you might want to go back and take a look at an earlier fireside chat that we had with Anson Park and Edgar Hassler, the 2 guys from American Express that were guests on an early fireside chat, because they talked about online marketing experiments quite a bit. That's what those 2 guys do. And I thought that was a very informative fireside chat. So that might be one that you might want to take a look at, because we don't really talk about online marketing experiments in the course. But they had a very interesting presentation, and some of the questions and some of the discussion we had were quite, I thought, quite insightful. Okay, that is the end of our questions for today. We got them all done, and conveniently, we're just about out of time. I think we have perhaps 1 or 2 minutes left. Our next fireside chat is Wednesday, March the 10th, and I have a guest lined up for that fireside chat that I think you're going to really enjoy. He is going to talk about confirmation experiments, something that we don't spend a lot of time on in the course, but I think you'll find this to be a very enjoyable presentation. Thank you again for tuning in for our fireside chat, and I hope you're enjoying the course. And if there are things that you want to connect up with me on outside of this fireside chat or the course, please feel free to get in touch with me. And Christine, thank you again for spending a chunk of your morning with us in our fireside chat.
It was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Bye to everybody.